The morning arrived the way difficult things often do in Vermont, quietly, without apology. A low sky pressed itself flat over the town of Harlow, the kind of gray that doesn't threaten rain so much as it simply refuses to lift. The maple trees along the square had surrendered their last leaves weeks ago, and what remained of the season stood stripped and bare and honest in the cold. October in New England had always carried that particular quality, a stripped-down truthfulness that softer climates never managed. The world looked exactly like what it was. Nothing hidden, nothing dressed up, just the bare shape of things left standing after everything decorative had fallen away. Eleanor Marsh knew that feeling well. She sat on the second bench from the left in Harlow's town square, the same bench she had occupied most mornings for the past several months, her old canvas backpack wedged against her right leg like something she was afraid might be stolen. A paper cup of coffee rested in her left hand, long cold the rim, slightly bent, where she'd been pressing her thumb against it without realizing. She wasn't drinking it anymore. She was just holding it the way a person sometimes holds onto something simply because letting go of one more thing feels like more than they can manage. People moved through the square around her the way water moves around a stone. Not with hostility, not exactly. There was something more practiced than hostility in the way the residents of Harlow had learned to navigate their relationship with Eleanor's presence. A woman in a down coat steered her children in a gentle arc around the bench without breaking stride. A man in a postal uniform walked a long route around the far side of the square rather than pass too close. It wasn't cruelty. Cruelty required engagement, required a person to register that you existed enough to wish you harm. What the town of Harlow had settled into was something quieter and in some ways harder to bear. Indifference, the kind that accumulates slowly the way ice forms on still water, layer by thin layer until the surface is so thick that nothing from below can break through anymore. Eleanor had been part of the scenery for long enough now that most people had simply stopped noticing her. She had become, without ceremony or announcement, a fixture, like the old war memorial at the north end of the square. Square like the peeling paint on the gazebo, nobody got around to fixing like the last dry leaf clinging to the oak tree near the fountain long after the others had gone. Present, unremarkable, quietly overlooked. She was 62 years old. There had been a time when every person who walked into the Sunrise Diner on Caldwell Street knew her name before they sat down. A time when her voice had been one of those voices a town runs on steady, warm, the kind that remembered how you took your coffee and asked after your mother without being prompted. For 31 years, she had worked that floor, white sneakers on cracked linoleum, a coffee pot in one hand and an order pad in the other, building a life out of small gestures and consistent presence. She had known the pharmacist's wife was having a rough pregnancy before the pharmacist told anyone because Eleanor had noticed the crackers she kept ordering with her tea. She had known the Whitmore boy was being bullied at school because he sat facing the wall on Tuesdays and Thursdays and ate his lunch so fast it looked like practice for disappearing. She had slipped extra sausage onto the plate of the retired schoolteacher who always ordered the small breakfast and spent too long over the check doing the arithmetic with trembling fingers. She had never mentioned it, never expected thanks. It was simply the way she understood the work. Feed people, notice things, show up. For 31 years, that had been enough. The diner had not replaced her when she left. It had simply changed ownership 4 months after Marcus died, and the new manager had a list of names to cut, and Eleanor's name was on it, and that had been that. No ceremony, no 31-year goodbye. Just a printed note on a Tuesday and the sound of the back door closing behind her for the last time. Marcus. Even now, even sitting in the cold with the empty cup in her hand and the whole gray town moving around her without stopping, the name landed inside her the way a stone lands in deep water. Not a splash, a plunge. The kind that sends disturbance all the way to the bottom. He had been 27 years old. The kind of young man who still kissed his mother on the cheek in front of other people, which she had pretended to find embarrassing and had privately kept as one of the great dignities of her life. He had her eyes and his father's stubbornness and a laugh that arrived without warning and took up more room than seemed physically possible for one person. He had been funny in the particular way of people who have also been hurt, the kind of humor that comes from having learned early that lightness is a choice you make, not a condition you're born into. He died on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, on a road outside of Burlington that should have been salted and wasn't. A truck from a regional carrier crossed the center line on a curve and hit his car at a speed that ensured Marcus never knew what had happened. That was what the state trooper had told her, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands. He never knew. Eleanor had held on to that for a long time. She still held on to it. It was the smallest mercy available, and she kept it close. After Marcus, the house changed, not physically. The rooms were the same rooms. The cracked porch swing still hung at the same angle. The marigolds she had planted along the front walk were still there, frost dead now, but still rooted. But something in the air of the house altered in a way that wasn't visible and couldn't be fixed, like a frequency had shifted slightly off, and everything that had once resonated there now simply did not. Clifton tried. She would give him that, and she had given it many times over the years silently, in the middle of the night when she was being fair to his memory. He had tried. For almost 8 months after Marcus died, Clifton Marsh had sat at the kitchen table and attended dinners and slept in the bed they had shared for 26 years, and done all the outward things that resembled a life. But something had gone offline inside him, some essential circuit, and Eleanor had watched it happen the way you watch weather approaching across open ground. You can see it coming from a long way off. That doesn't mean there's anything you can do about it. On a Wednesday in August, 14 months after Marcus's accident, Clifton packed a duffel bag and stood in the kitchen doorway at 6:30 in the morning. Eleanor was at the counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She had known it was coming. She had known it was coming for months. He said he couldn't breathe in the house anymore. She looked at him and she said, "So that's it?" He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, but no, it isn't enough. And the knowing makes the saying worse somehow. Eleanor set down her coffee cup and said, "You're not sorry, you're tired." She said it quietly without bitterness, the way you state a fact about weather. There's a difference. He left anyway. What followed was the part of grief nobody talks about much, the administrative grief, the grief that comes wrapped in envelopes. The hospital had sent the final statements from Marcus's last hours in pieces across the months after his death, each one arriving like an aftershock. The mortgage on the house on Birchfield Road was 3 months behind before Eleanor had even understood how far the ground had shifted beneath her. She sold furniture, jewelry she hadn't worn in years, her good winter coat. Extra shifts at the diner before the ownership change took that option away. She filed for assistance in February, sat across from a county worker at a press board desk, and answered questions about income and assets and living situation with the particular kind of dignity that comes from having no alternatives left. She had never asked for anything she hadn't earned. That had been her understanding of the arrangement. You show up, you work, you are decent to people. The arrangement holds. The arrangement did not hold. By the following spring, the bank had posted the notice. By June, the house on Birchfield Road belonged to someone else. By August, Eleanor Marsh was sleeping on a cot in the St. Luke's Hospitality Center on nights when there was room, and on the bench in Harlow Town Square on nights when there wasn't. A social worker named Nadine Foss had found her near the library one evening and sat beside her on the steps with the practiced gentleness of someone who had learned to approach broken things slowly. Nadine had offered the cot at St. Luke's and a meal and the promise of case coordination in the morning. Eleanor had said, and after the morning, Nadine had hesitated in the careful way of someone who understood the question completely and had no good answer for it. "We try again." Eleanor had looked at the library steps and said, "I've been trying again in places that weren't meant for me to stay in. That's the problem." Nadine had softened. "You need somewhere safe, Eleanor." Eleanor had said, "What I need is one place that doesn't disappear when I wake up." That was the thing no warmth at arm's length ever addressed. Not the hunger, not the cold, both of which were real and serious and not to be understated. But underneath those quieter and more corrosive was the temporary nature of every mercy offered. A cot for one night, a hot meal for one afternoon, a voucher, a referral, a hand on the shoulder attached to an arm, attached to a person who had to go home at 5 o'clock. Every kindness had an expiration date, and after enough of them, you stopped being able to receive them fully because some part of you was always already preparing for the moment they ran out. Eleanor had learned to hold the cold cup without feeling it. She had learned to look at the town moving around her without needing it to stop. She had learned the particular discipline of existing inside other people's indifference without taking it personally. Not because it wasn't personal, but because if you took it personally, you would have to feel all of it, and all of it was more than a person could hold standing up. So she sat, and the town moved, and the October sky stayed flat and gray and honest above Harlow, Vermont. She did not see the black sedan pull into the north end of the square until it had already parked. It was the kind of car that commanded a certain quiet attention without being ostentatious about it, dark and well-maintained, the kind of car that appeared at estate sales and probate offices and delivered news that required a person to be sitting down. A man got out of the driver's side. He was tall, past 65, with the upright carriage of someone who had spent decades being the most composed person in difficult rooms. Dark wool coat, polished shoes catching flat light, gray hair cropped close. He stood beside the car for a moment and looked around the square with the methodical patience of someone checking an address against a description. Then he walked directly toward her. Eleanor's first instinct was the instinct of someone who had lived outdoors long enough to develop a finely calibrated awareness of when other people's attention was directed her way. She read the man the way she read the square every morning, quickly and accurately cataloging risk without appearing to do it. He was not town. She knew most of Harlow's faces. He was not the county worker rotation. He did not have the soft, careful expression of someone approaching a person they expected to frighten. He had something else entirely. He had the face of a man who had made a decision and then arrived to carry it out. He stopped in front of her bench and said her name. Not the kind of name saying that was a question, the kind that was a statement. Mrs. Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor looked up at him. Depends on who's asking. Gerald Morse. He reached into his coat and produced a card which he offered to her without any of the awkwardness such gestures sometimes carried when directed at a person in her situation. I'm an attorney. I've been looking for you for some time. Eleanor took the card. She looked at it briefly and then looked at him. That sounds expensive. May I sit down? She moved her backpack a few inches. Bench isn't mine. He sat beside her with the unhurried deliberateness of a man accustomed to delivering news that required the other person to have a moment to prepare for it. He placed a thick manila envelope on his knee. Then he set something on top of the envelope, something that made a soft metallic sound against the paper, and Eleanor looked down at it before she meant to. A ring of old keys, brass worn smooth at the bow, the teeth dark with age. 3 keys on a plain ring that had the particular patina of objects that had lived in drawers for decades. Eleanor stared at them. You looking for someone else? She said. No, ma'am. He turned slightly toward her. I found exactly who I was looking for. Gerald Morse handed her the manila envelope and explained in the precise and unhurried manner of a man who had delivered this kind of information before that a probate matter had been settled and that Eleanor had been named as a beneficiary. Eleanor opened the envelope with stiff fingers, pulled the papers free, and began to read. Legal language moved past her like water over rock until a specific number assembled itself on the page and her brain stopped. $1. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh that carried no warmth whatsoever. The kind of laugh that is not amusement, but its inverse. A will, she said. Someone left me $1. A couple had slowed their walk nearby, drawn by some subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way people in public spaces are always drawn by the faint scent of spectacle. The man in the couple looked at the paper Eleanor was holding, and then at his companion, and said something under his breath that produced a small shared smirk. His companion glanced at Eleanor with an expression that occupied the particular territory between pity and contempt. The man said loud enough to carry, well, that ought to turn things around. Heat moved through Eleanor's chest. She held up the page. This is a joke. It is not, Morse said. $1. She shook her head slowly. Who goes to the trouble of dying just to insult somebody? Gerald Morse looked at her with the steady patience of a man who had prepared for this reaction and was not surprised by it. He picked up the keyring from the envelope and placed it in her palm, folding her fingers around it deliberately, the way you close someone's hand around something you need them not to drop. The dollar is symbolic, he said. The real inheritance is a property. Eleanor looked down at the worn brass in her hand. A property. Yes, an old estate. outside of town deep in the woods about 40 minutes east on Bircham Hollow Road. She looked at him. Why would anyone leave that to me? He held her gaze steadily. Because of who you are and what you've carried. And because the person who arranged this believed that was exactly the right qualification. That was not the answer she had expected. She had expected something practical, something transactional, some distant relative's legal obligation or a clerical confusion about names. She had not expected something that sounded in its quiet way deliberate. Who left it? A woman named Edith Vance Coulter. She passed away 6 months ago. She was 78. No children, no spouse. Morse paused. She was the last surviving granddaughter of a woman named Dorothy Vance, who built and lived in the estate for most of the mid-20th century. Edith had her grandmother's property and her grandmother's secrets, and she spent most of her adult life trying to find the courage to do something about the latter. Eleanor frowned. I've never heard either of those names. No, you wouldn't have. Morse looked at the keys in her hand. Edith didn't choose you because she knew you. She chose you because of what she learned about what happened to you. She spent the last years of her life looking for a specific kind of person. My firm searched for 8 months before we found you. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. 8 months, she said. Edith was very specific about her criteria. What criteria? Morse was quiet for a moment long enough that Eleanor understood the pause was intentional, that he was measuring something. Then he said, someone who had lost everything and was still here. The couple who had been watching had moved on. The town square continued its ordinary Thursday morning around them. The postal worker was back on the long route the kids from the school 3 blocks over were cutting through on their way somewhere. The coffee shop was producing its usual ribbon of warmth from the vent above the door. Everything was precisely as it had been 20 minutes ago. The world had not rearranged itself. And yet Eleanor sat on the bench with old keys pressing into her palm and something moving in her chest that she could not immediately name. She did not go with Morse that day. He left her with the keys and a number to call, and the address written on a card in ink that looked older than the card itself. He offered to drive her out that afternoon if she wanted. She said she would think about it. He nodded as though that was a perfectly reasonable response to being handed the keys to an estate you'd never heard of on a cold morning in October, and he walked back to the black sedan and drove away. Eleanor sat for a long time after that. She turned the keys over in her hand. She looked at the address on the card. She thought about 8 months. The idea that someone had spent 8 months looking for her, specifically not for someone like her, not for a general category of person, but for Eleanor Marsh, who had been a waitress for 3 decades in a small Vermont town and had lost a son and a husband and a house and a pool and ended up on a park bench with a cold cup of coffee. That idea had a weight to it that she couldn't put down easily. Nadine Foss found her that evening near the library steps, as she sometimes did on the colder nights, and offered the cot at St. Luke's. Eleanor went, but she lay awake on the narrow cot in the humming dark of the shelter long after the room had quieted, the keyring in her closed hand pressing its old teeth against her palm. She thought about the word property. The word felt strange on her, like a coat that belonged to someone with different dimensions. There had been a time when the word had meant something ordinary and personal to her, the narrow white house on Birchfield Road with the cracked porch swing and the marigolds she put in every spring, and the kitchen where she had learned the precise angle at which Marcus would tilt his head when he was trying not to laugh at something he should have found serious. That word had meant all of that once. The bank had turned that word into paperwork. She thought about a woman named Edith Vance Coulter dying at 78 with no children and no husband, and a grandmother's secret she had spent decades not knowing what to do with. She thought about choosing a stranger. She thought about 8 months of looking. She thought about what Morse had said. Someone who had lost everything and was still here. Was she still here? She was breathing. Her heart moved the blood through her body with the mechanical loyalty of a thing that had not been given the option of deciding whether to continue. She woke up in the mornings and put one foot down and then the other and navigated through the hours until it was dark again and she could stop navigating for a while. She was present in the technical sense. She showed up in the world in the sense that the world could see her when it bothered to look. But still here, in the way that woman had meant, it was something more specific than biological persistence. Eleanor turned the keys over and thought about that distinction for a long time in the dark. In the morning, she borrowed Nadine's car. Nadine asked only one question, the careful question of a woman who had learned when to push and when to trust. "You sure you want to go alone?" Eleanor said. "I think I need to see it without anyone watching my face." She drove east on Route 9 and then turned onto a county road she didn't recognize, and then onto Birch Hollow Road, which was narrow and unpaved and lined on both sides with northern white pine and bare-limbed sugar maples that arched over the road and made it feel like driving through the spine of something large and old. The road went for a long time, longer than she had expected. The town of Harlow disappeared entirely in the rearview mirror, and then the rearview mirror held nothing but trees and the gray sky above them, and the faint pale light that passes for morning in Vermont when autumn is almost done. Then the trees opened. The estate stood at the far end of a clearing with the quality of something that had been standing too long to be easily surprised. It was not what she had imagined. She hadn't known what she'd imagined until she saw that it was different. She had imagined she supposed something grand in the way she understood grandness, the kind of old New England property that appeared on the civic calendar covers, white clapboard and black shutters, and the polished confidence of old money maintained across generations. What she found instead was something older than that and less certain of itself. The main structure was a large timber frame buildings, wood gone gray and dark with decades of weather, a wraparound porch that sagged sharply on the eastern side, two upper windows cracked clean through a stone chimney, leaning at an angle that made a cautious person think about structural patience. Wild vines had claimed the porch posts. The front steps were intact, but the third one from the bottom had a hairline fracture running across it that would eventually become a break. The roof dipped slightly in the center, the way all things dip when they've been carrying weight for a very long time. Eleanor sat in the borrowed car for a full minute before she got out. She stepped onto the dead-leaf carpet of the clearing and walked slowly toward the porch. The air was cold and held the smell of pine resin and wet rot and something underneath it that was harder to name, something like cedar and cold ash, and the particular smell of a house that had been closed for longer than houses are meant to be closed. Somewhere deeper in the property, water moved over rocks in the way small streams do in early winter, grudgingly not yet committed to freezing. A pickup truck rattled slowly along the county road beyond the clearing's edge and stopped. The driver, an older man in a blaze-orange hunting cap, leaned out the window and looked from Eleanor to the house with the frank curiosity of rural New England that is not quite politeness and not quite its opposite. "You planning on going in there?" Eleanor looked at him over her shoulder, thinking about it. The man in the truck made a low sound that was more assessment than disapproval. "That place should have been torn down 30 years ago. Probably should have been torn down 40 years ago. Nobody's touched it since Edith Coulter stopped coming out this way, and she stopped coming out years before she died. You knew her, knew of her. Quiet woman. Came out to the property now and then didn't talk to anybody. Never understood what she was looking for." He shrugged with the philosophical ease of a man who had seen a lot of things that didn't yield to understanding. "Guess some things don't know when to let go." He drove on. Eleanor climbed the porch steps, carefully avoiding the cracked third one. The front door was scarred and weather-warped, the wood dark and dense, but it was not broken. It had the solid quality of old timber that had gone past vulnerable into something like permanent. The lock was original hardware iron plate and brass cylinder, the kind that had been made before manufacturers started making locks primarily for the convenience of people who forget their keys. She put the first key in the lock. It did not fit. The second key fit but would not turn. The third key slid in cleanly, and Eleanor turned it, and the mechanism engaged with a sound so sharp and certain in the cold air that she stood completely still for a moment, both hands on the key, as though startled by the directness of the house's response. Then she pushed the door open. The air inside was dense and stale in the way of rooms that have held themselves closed for a long time. But beneath the staleness was something else, cedar. Definitely. Cedar and cold ash from a fireplace that had not been lit in years, and something faint and sweet. She couldn't identify, some combination of old wood and dried flowers, and time itself, as though the house had been sealed with this particular moment still inside it. Light came through the dirty windows in pale flat stripes that illuminated the floating dust her entrance had disturbed. She stood in the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The front room was large. Furniture draped in white sheets that had gathered years of dust in their folds stood around the perimeter like figures waiting to be recognized. A rocking chair sat near the far wall, beside the fireplace uncovered, as though someone had used it last and simply forgotten to put the sheet back. The stone fireplace was cold and deep and blackened from decades of use that had ended abruptly. On the mantel, a small clock stood stopped. Framed photographs hung on the walls, their images faded by the slow damage of diffuse light across decades, but not gone, faces still visible if she moved close enough. A side table near the front window held a teacup. Eleanor stood in the cold room and looked at the teacup for a long moment. Someone had left a cup of tea on that table and walked out of this room and not come back. The tea was long gone, of course, evaporated into the dry air of however many winters had passed in the house's silence. But the cup remained in its saucer with the particular eloquence of an interrupted thing, as though whoever had set it there had intended only to step away briefly and had been prevented from returning by something they had not anticipated. Eleanor stepped fully inside. The floor was solid beneath her. The boards creaked in the specific language of old timber, each step producing a different note, as though the house was cataloging her movement through it, filing her footsteps against some internal record. She walked to the rocking chair and put her hand on the back of it. The wood was cold and smooth. She pulled the sheet off the nearest chair, and the dust came off it in a slow cloud that drifted in the pale light, and underneath was a wingback chair in faded blue fabric that had once been a specific and chosen shade of something richer. She began to work, not because she had decided to stay, or at least not consciously, not in the form of a made decision, with a before and after to it. She began to work the way she had always begun work, the way she had unlocked the diner every morning for 31 years, not with fanfare or deliberation, but with the simple physical logic of seeing what needed doing and doing it. She found a broom in the pantry at the back of the kitchen, its bristles stiff, but intact. She found a bucket and an old rag under the kitchen sink. She opened windows in the rooms that had functional latches and left them cracked to let the cold air move through and carry some of the decades out. She pulled dust sheets and folded them. She swept dead leaves that had blown in through the gaps around the window frames. She moved through the rooms slowly, not cataloging them exactly, not taking inventory, but learning the dimensions of the place in the way you learn a person gradually by moving through their space. The kitchen was at the back of the house, larger than she expected, built for a different era's understanding of domestic work. A cast-iron stove sat against one wall. The counters were wooden scarred with the kind of wear that comes from years of actual use. A long workable occupied the center of the room, its surface still holding the ghost shapes of things that had once rested on it, rings from pots of faint stain that might have been beet or wine or something else entirely. The window above the sink looked out onto the back of the property, where the clearing gave way to the tree line and the woods pressed close and dark and old. It was in the sitting room that she found it. She had been sweeping near the large fireplace on the south wall, working her way along the baseboard in the methodical way of someone who knew how to clean a room properly, and she noticed the sound first. A section of the floor near the hearth produced a different note under the broom handle, not louder, not softer, different. Hollow in a way the boards on either side of it were not. Eleanor stopped. She tapped the section with the broom handle again. The hollow sound came back clean and clear and distinct. She set the broom aside and crouched on the dusty floor. She looked at the boards closely in the pale light from the window. They were old, consistent with the rest of the floor, gray-brown and worn. But at one end of a particular section, the nails were less corroded than the others. Not new, not obviously different from a standing position. But up close at floor level, the contrast was clear enough. Those nails had been disturbed within living memory and driven back in with care. Eleanor ran her fingertips along the edge of the boards and felt the faintest seam, a hairline gap where a tighter fit had once existed and been pried apart and reassembled. She went to the kitchen and found a butter knife in a drawer swollen with age and returned with it to the sitting room. She knelt on the floor and worked the blade into the seam at the end of the loosened board. The wood resisted. Old timber holds its secrets with a physical stubbornness that has to be negotiated rather than forced. She applied steady pressure, and the wood groaned low and dry, and then gave lifting with a creak that seemed too loud in the closed quiet of the house. Beneath the board was a narrow cavity, not deep, perhaps 8 inches, wide enough to accommodate what was sitting in it. A tin box, dull gray-green with age roughly the size of a shoebox, but shallower, its lid fitted tightly. No markings on the outside, no inscription, just a box sitting in its hollow in the dark under the floor of a house that had been waiting for someone to come. Eleanor looked at it for a full minute before she touched it. Then she lifted it out with both hands. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it to the wingback chair she'd uncovered earlier and sat down with it in her lap and held it there for a moment longer. She opened the lid. Inside were three things. A bundle of photographs tied with a strip of blue ribbon that had once been vivid and had faded to the particular soft color that old things achieve when the original intensity has mellowed, but not disappeared. She set this aside carefully. A silver locket on a thin chain gone nearly black with tarnish, its surface carrying the texture of age and the invisible residue of the hands that had last held it. She set this beside the photographs, and a letter folded twice the paper, cream-colored and brittle at the edges but intact, sealed with a fold rather than an envelope. Eleanor unfolded it carefully, aware of the brittleness at the creases. The handwriting was deliberate and clear, the cursive of a different era's education, each letter formed with the patience of a person who understood that what they were writing was meant to last. She read the first line. "If you are reading this, then you are the one who finally came." Eleanor stopped. She read the line again, the way you read something when your brain needs the second pass to believe what the first pass reported. She read it a third time. Below it, separated by a space that felt like a breath held and then released, was the next line. This house was never meant for the greedy. The cold air in the sitting room seemed to thicken slightly. Not a sound, not a movement, just a quality of attention in the stillness that had not been there a moment before, as though the house itself were listening to the sound of its own words being read. Eleanor kept reading. The letter was not long. It had the density of something written by a person who had learned to compress meaning, who understood that the person on the other end of it might not have much left in the way of patience for excess. It gave no name, no date, no clear explanation of how or why the letters had come to be here in the floor of this room in this house at the edge of these particular woods. But its intention was unmistakable. Whoever had written this had understood that the wrong kind of person would search this house and find nothing of use and leave. They had understood that greed was a form of impatience and that impatient people were poor searchers. They had written for someone else entirely. Someone who would sweep the floors. Someone who would notice the hollow sound in the boards, not because they were hunting for treasure, but because they knew how floors were supposed to sound. The letter ended with a single line, set apart from the rest by a wider space above it, as though its writer had paused before putting it down. "If pain brought you here, do not leave yet." Eleanor lowered the letter into her lap. She sat in the cold room with the afternoon light thinning through the dirty windows, and the photographs beside her, and the tarnished locket, and the letter in her hands, and she did not move for a long time. Her whole life she had watched the world sort itself into the people whose grief was taken seriously, and the people whose grief was treated as a personal failure or evidence of inadequate resilience, as a condition to be managed rather than a truth to be acknowledged. She had known men who had lost businesses and been called unfortunate, and she had known women who had lost everything and been called a cautionary tale. She had watched the town of Harlow learn to navigate around her with the careful avoidance of people who didn't want her suffering to contaminate their field of vision. But whoever had written this letter had believed the opposite. They had believed that pain endured long enough became something other than weakness. They had believed that what the world called diminishment was sometimes closer to distillation, that the person left standing after everything unnecessary had been stripped away was not a smaller person, but in some ways a more essential one, harder to deceive, harder to buy, more capable of recognizing truth when she held it in her hands. Edith Vance Coulter had spent 8 months looking for Eleanor Marsh specifically. Eleanor looked around the cold, dust-heavy room at the chair no one had sat in for decades at. The clock stopped on the mantel, at the photographs still hanging crooked on the walls, with their faded faces at the teacup on the side table that was still waiting for its person to come back. She was not warm, she was not comfortable. The house was cold and old and would require a great deal of work before it was anything other than a cold old house. There was no reason by any practical accounting for her to stay. She pulled her coat tighter and stayed. The afternoon went and the evening came in through the dirty windows in shades of blue and gray, and Eleanor did not leave. She built no fire because she didn't yet trust the chimney. She ate the sandwich Nadine had packed in the bag she'd left in the car. She found the faded sofa beneath its dust sheet and dragged it closer to the cold fireplace and made her arrangement on it with the coat she had been wearing. She lay on the sofa in the dark house with the letter inside her coat against her chest. She listened to the house settle around her, each groan and creak of old timber adjusting to the cold, the way it sounded almost intentional, almost like a thing deciding whether to accept her. Outside the woods held the deep Vermont silence of mid-October after the tourists had gone, and before the skiers had arrived, the silence of a place that has returned to itself and is not performing anything for anyone. For the first time in longer than she could count clearly, Eleanor Marsh was sleeping indoors. Not well, not warmly. The coat was not enough and the sofa was not comfortable, and the house was cold enough that her breath made small, visible shapes in the air above her face. But she was inside four walls that were not a shelter cot and not a park bench, and not a borrowed corner of someone else's temporary arrangement. She was inside. And somewhere in the darkness above her, in the rooms she had not yet entered, in the journals and maps and documents and truths she had not yet found, a woman named Dorothy Vance was waiting to be heard. Eleanor closed her hand around the key ring on the cushion beside her. Gerald Morse arrived the next morning at 7:15, his sedan moving slowly up the dirt track through the trees as though testing the ground's willingness to hold him. Eleanor was already on the porch with the remains of the coffee she'd made on the old propane burner she'd found in the pantry, a single-ring camp stove that had been left behind with a half-full canister, and the practical logic of someone who had understood that whoever came next would need warmth before they needed anything else. Morse stepped out of the car and looked at her standing on the porch and then at the state of the front room, visible through the open door behind her, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, recognition perhaps. The recognition of a man who had formed a specific expectation and found it exceeded. "You stayed," he said. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The house didn't object. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked at what she'd done with the front room. The dust sheets folded and stacked against the far wall. The furniture standing in its own proper shapes without years of accumulated gray on top of it. The windows cracked for air. The floor swept and the leaves gone. The rocking chair positioned near the hearth as though someone might actually wait and get it to end. "You did all this last night. Needed something to do with my hands." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "I found something in the floor." She led him inside and showed him the tin box on the side table where she'd left it, the photographs and the locket and the folded letter arranged beside it. Morse picked up the letter and read it with the careful thoroughness of a man trained to find implications in the space between sentences. He read it through once and then read it again more slowly. When he set it down, the composed professional certainty he wore the way other men wore good suits had developed a quality she hadn't seen in it before. Wariness. "No signature," he said, "no. But whoever wrote it knew someone would come looking who wasn't supposed to find anything." Eleanor picked up one of the photographs from the bundle tied with the faded blue ribbon. "I think this is the woman who wrote it." The photograph showed the front of the estate in a different season. Summer or late spring. The porch not yet sagged, the mains not yet claiming the posts, the windows whole and bright. A woman stood on the front steps with her hands at her sides, unsmiling. Not the artificial stillness of someone unaccustomed to cameras, but the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided how she wanted to be seen. Strong-faced, direct, the kind of eyes that suggested she had already assessed the person looking at her and formed a complete opinion before they had had a chance to speak. Morse studied the photograph. "I believe that's Dorothy Vance." "She wrote it," Eleanor said. "I don't know how I know that, but she did." He looked at her steadily. "There may be more." That was when Eleanor told him about the kitchen. She had moved through the rest of the house the previous evening after dark, not searching exactly, but present in a way that was different from ordinary occupancy. She had walked each room with the attentiveness of someone who has been told without being told in so many words that there is something here worth finding. And in the kitchen during the hour before the cold became too serious to work in, she had noticed the rug. It was a thick woven rug, dark wool in a pattern of deep reds and greens that had faded to something richer and less distinct. Over time, the kind of rug that belonged in a sitting room or a parlor rather than a kitchen floor. It was centered in the kitchen with the deliberateness of something placed with intention, not pushed against a wall or tucked under the table in the practical way of kitchen floor coverings. Centered, as though it had been put there specifically to cover what was underneath it. Eleanor had not moved it the night before. She had stood at the edge of it in the near dark and looked at it and decided that some things were better found in daylight with another person present. She and Morse moved into the kitchen together. The rug was heavy and stiff and required both of them to roll it back. Beneath it, set flush into the kitchen floorboards, was a circular iron ring, flat and dark with rust attached to a recessed iron plate. The whole assembly designed to be invisible unless you were looking for it or had rolled back the rug that was meant to prevent exactly that. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor said quietly, "That wasn't there by accident." Morse crouched and ran his fingers around the iron ring and the plate surrounding it, testing the fit of the wood against the hardware. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Eleanor looked at him. Together. They gripped the ring between them and pulled. The door resisted with the comprehensive stubbornness of old wood swollen by decades of moisture and cold, the kind of resistance that is not mechanical failure, but simple accumulation, the weight of time pressing downward from above. They pulled harder, and the wood groaned with a low, dragging complaint, and then released, swinging upward on hinges that had been kept oiled long after everything else in the house had been allowed to go to its natural state of slow dissolution. Cold air rose from below. Not the cold of October outside, a different cold. Deeper and stiller, the cold of a sealed space that had held its temperature unchanged across decades of seasons above it. The cold of a place that had been preserved precisely because it had been sealed away from the ordinary passage of time. Morse shone his flashlight down. Stone walls, packed earth floor, a ceiling low enough that a standing adult would need to crouch. The space was no larger than a generous closet, roughly 8 feet by 10, the dimensions of something built not for living in, but for keeping. He went down the ladder first, each rung testing under his weight and holding. Eleanor followed, one hand on the rails, the other holding the camp lantern she'd found in the pantry. The cellar floor was solid and dry. Against the far wall, a set of rough wooden shelves held old glass jars, most clouded, and sealed the contents indeterminate and dark. A wool blanket, moth-eaten and folded, hung from a nail driven into the mortar between the stones. Someone had put it there with the same quiet preparedness as the propane stove upstairs. Someone who understood that whoever came might be cold and might need to stay. In the corner, sitting on the packed earth floor as though it had been placed there with the care of something both heavy and irreplaceable, was a wooden chest. It was not large. Perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, banded in iron straps that had gone red and brown with age, the iron still structurally sound beneath the oxidation. A brass clasp on the front, green with verdigris, secured the lid. The wood itself was dark with age and sealed with something pitch or oil or linseed. It was hard to tell that had kept the moisture from penetrating the joints. Whoever had built this chest had built it to last, and whoever had put it here had trusted that it would. Eleanor stood in front of it and did not immediately reach for it. She had learned over the course of the last 18 hours in this house that the things worth finding inside it were not things that rewarded impatience. The house had its own rhythm, and that rhythm was slow and deliberate, and asked something of you before it gave something back. She stood with the lantern in her hand and looked at the chest and let herself understand that this was the thing the letter had been pointing toward. This was the room the rug had been hiding. This was the reason Dorothy Vance had believed that only a specific kind of person should find their way here. Morse tried the clasp. It held. He climbed back up the ladder and returned with the pry bar Eleanor had found in the shed behind the house the previous afternoon, a short iron bar with a flattened end, old but solid. He worked the flat end into the gap between the clasp housing and the wood and applied steady leverage. The clasp held for a long moment with the resistance of hardware that had never been asked to fail before, and then it gave with a sharp metallic crack that rang off the stone walls and hung in the cellar air. Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside the chest, arranged with a care that spoke of repeated handling and deliberate organization over many years, were 4 categories of thing: 6 journals, bound in calfskin leather, each approximately 200 pages, their covers worn smooth and supple at the edges and corners by the friction of hands that had carried them often. Each bore the same name inscribed on the inside front cover, in the same dark, deliberate cursive that Eleanor recognized from the letter upstairs. Dorothy Vance. Rolled maps, 6 of them secured with twine and wrapped individually in waxed cloth that had kept the paper supple and intact. They were the kind of large-format survey maps that predate digital record-keeping, hand-drawn on heavy stock, with notations in ink and pencil, the boundaries of land parcels marked in the precise, patient language of mid-century cartography. A packet of letters, perhaps 40 or 50 of them, sorted into groups and secured with elastic that had long since perished and been replaced at some point with kitchen twine. The paper was varied, some letters on good stationery, some on notebook paper, some on the backs of other documents. The handwriting on the envelopes was not consistent, which meant they came from multiple correspondents. And a thick bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth secured with a leather strap, the kind of careful waterproofing applied to things whose value is specifically contingent on their physical legibility remaining intact across an indefinite period of time. Legal papers, the kind of thing a person wraps in oilcloth and puts in an iron-banded chest in a sealed cellar under their kitchen floor, when they have reason to believe that leaving them in a filing cabinet is not a sufficient guarantee of their survival. Morse reached for the oilcloth packet first. Eleanor reached for the top journal. They carried everything up through the hatch and spread it on the kitchen table. The gray morning light coming flat through the window above the sink and falling across decades of hidden things finally in open air. For a moment, they both stood on opposite sides of the table and looked at the full extent of what they'd found. The journals and the maps and the letters and the documents spread across that old scarred surface had the quality of an arrival rather than a discovery, as though they had been here all along, just below the floor, waiting for the room above them to be ready. Eleanor opened the first journal. The initial pages were, as she had half expected, quietly ordinary. Weather observations, notes on household repairs, records of transactions with neighboring farms and the merchants in Harlow. The rhythms of a working property in the 1940s recorded in a handwriting that was efficient and regular and carried the quality of a mind that tracked things not for sentimentality, but for accuracy. Dorothy Vance wrote the way Eleanor had always kept the diner's order pad, every detail present, because details mattered, because you could not know in advance which ones would matter most. But beneath the domestic record was a different register. Dorothy had the habit of a mind too alert for its circumstances, and it emerged in the gaps between the practical entries in observations that went slightly further than the surface of a thing required. A note about a conversation at the feed store that said more about the men involved than the feed prices discussed. A description of a town meeting that was also, in its careful way, an assessment of who was afraid of what and why. A woman forced to observe precisely because the world around her had learned to underestimate precision in women. Eleanor turned pages, then she found it. The handwriting on the page was the same, but the pressure of the pen had changed. Deeper, more deliberate. They took the North Tract in daylight and called it lawful. They took it from men too poor to fight back and from widows too tired to be heard. They used the law the way a man uses a knife. He didn't forge himself borrowed and sharp and pointed at someone who never agreed to the terms. Eleanor looked up. Morse had unfolded one of the documents from the oilcloth packet and was standing very still with it in both hands. He looked up at the same moment. "Read that again," he said. She did. He set the document down and crossed to her side of the table and read the journal entry over her shoulder. Then he went back to his document and picked it up again, holding it beside a second sheet he'd pulled from the packet, one in each hand, moving his eyes between them with the focused, narrowed attention of a man checking something he almost doesn't want to confirm. He set them both down on the table side by side. "Look at these," he said. Eleanor crossed to his side. On the table lay 2 property transfer documents, each roughly a page in length, each carrying the official formatting of mid-century county legal records. She looked at the signatures on both. One name on the first, a different name on the second. The same handwriting on both. She had spent 31 years reading other people's handwriting on order slips and receipts and notes left under coffee cups. She knew what matching handwriting looked like. "Same person," she said. "Signed both documents. Different name." Morse's voice had gone quiet in the way that was not calm, but was the thing that sits just beyond calm when a person is processing something serious. "I've handled estate disputes for 40 years. I've seen forged signatures before. But this level of consistency, this is not an amateur." Eleanor went back to the journals. As the entries progressed across the pages and into the second and third volumes, a picture assembled itself the way pictures assembled in the diner. When she had paid enough attention, long enough detail by detail, until the shape of the thing became clear. The land around the Vance estate, and for several miles in each direction along the hollow, had not historically belonged to one family or one holding. It had been parceled across the 1920s and 1930s into smaller lots purchased by working families. Mill workers, farmers, three immigrant households who had bought their way into American ground acre by patient acre over years of hard labor and consistent saving. An African-American family that had been in the area since before the Civil War. 7 families in total, beginning in the mid-1940s according to Dorothy's account that changed. She recorded it with the precision of a woman who understood that precision was the only form of credibility available to her. A man named Ellison Hargrove, Warren Hargrove's grandfather Eleanor would later understand, had begun a process of acquisition that Dorothy described not as purchase, but as systematic dispossession. Debts were manufactured or magnified. Transfer documents appeared bearing signatures of people who had not in some cases been present at the transactions those documents recorded. Boundary lines in county records were redrawn in filings that postdated the surveys they supposedly codified. Men who raised objections were characterized in public record as unstable or unreliable. Women who objected were described in one county board minute as emotionally overwrought and confused about the nature of their agreements. Dorothy had written down every name, every date, every acre. Eleanor reached a page in the third journal and stopped. She read the line once and then put the journal flat on the table and stepped back from it slightly, the way you step back from something whose proximity feels like it might be too much. They stole everything. But I kept the truth. Morse was reading the letters now, working through them, methodically unfolding each one and reading it and refolding it and setting it aside. He had organized them into 2 groups. He looked up when Eleanor stepped back. "What did you find?" She pointed to the line. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a letter from his second group and handed it to her. It was written on plain paper in a handwriting that was labored and uncertain, the writing of a person for whom the physical act of putting words on paper was effortful, the letters formed with care rather than fluency. The paper was old and the ink had faded, but the words were legible. "My name is Agnes Pruitt. I am writing this because someone needs to know the true story of what happened to my land on the South Fork of Billet Creek. The men from the county came to my door and said I had signed a transfer. I told them I had not. I told them I could not. I told them that I have never learned to write my own name, and they knew this, and whoever they were talking about, it was not me. They said the record was clear. I said the record was a lie. But listen to me. I am writing this down so someone will know it happened. Agnes Pruitt, October 1947. Eleanor set the letter down on the table. The old kitchen was quiet around them. Outside the window, the Vermont woods held their late-season stillness, bare branches and cold sky, and the patient indifference of geography to the things people do to each other within it. "How many families?" Eleanor asked. 7 directly, potentially more if the connected parcels trace out fully. Morse had his glasses off and was rubbing the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. It was the first time she had seen him perform anything that resembled human tiredness. "Eleanor, if these documents are authentic, and I'm becoming increasingly certain that significant portions of them are, this is not one bad transaction. This is a coordinated pattern of fraudulent land transfer." "Hargrove," she said. "Ellison Hargrove started it, but looking at the timeline across these documents, it continued. The family's land holdings in this county didn't achieve their current scale in the 1940s. They were built across 2 more generations of accumulation, which means either the pattern continued or the original fraud was used as a foundation for legitimate expansion afterward." He picked up the forged transfer documents. "Either way, current members of the Hargrove family are holding property with a fraudulent chain of title." Eleanor looked at the journals stacked on the table. Dorothy knew they'd come after her if she went public. Almost certainly, the letter suggests she tried to engage an attorney in 1949. The attorney's response is in that stack. He pointed. It's polite and brief and says nothing that commits him to anything. "She was a woman alone on a rural property," Eleanor said, "in 1949. "Yes." Nobody was going to listen. No. So she kept it. Morse looked at the chest sitting open on the floor where they'd left it, the oilcloth and the twine, and the careful preservation of evidence meant to last long past its keeper. She spent the rest of her life keeping it, and then she passed the keeping to Edith. And Edith spent her life not knowing what to do with it, and used the last of her time finding someone she believed could. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back of the property where the clearing narrowed to a path leading into the trees. The woods were dense and dark, even in the pale morning, the kind of woods that have been growing without interruption long enough to develop a quality of depth that newer growth never quite achieves. Dorothy Vance had looked out this window. Edith Vance Coulter had looked out this window. And whatever they had seen when they looked at those trees, whatever combination of fear and determination, and the particular loneliness of being right, when the world around you has decided to be wrong, some residue of it remained in the cold air of the old kitchen. Eleanor turned from the window. "We need to take this to someone," she said. Morse nodded slowly. "I'll start with the county record office. Cross-reference the original surveys with the current filed boundaries. If Dorothy's maps show what I think they show, the discrepancies will be documentable independently of these journals. How long will that take? A few days, possibly a week." He began collecting the documents, carefully organizing them by category. "In the meantime, say nothing to anyone. Small towns have long memories and short distances between people." He left before noon, taking the oilcloth packet of legal documents and 2 of the journals, leaving Eleanor with the rest, the maps, the letters, and the remaining journals still to be read. She spent the afternoon with them, moving through Dorothy's account of the late 1940s and into the 1950s, watching the handwriting change subtly across the volumes as the years accumulated. The early journals had a quality of hot anger in them, the controlled anger of a person who has witnessed injustice and not yet accepted the full weight of being unable to stop it. The later journals were quieter, not resigned. Dorothy was never resigned, but tempered the way metal is tempered, hardened by the specific process of repeated heating and cooling of hope raised and then denied, until what remained was no longer hot, but was harder than it had been before. One late entry dated sometime in the early 1960s stopped Eleanor completely. "If I fail to stop them, I will not let them own the story as well. They can take the land. They cannot have the truth. The truth goes into the ground with me, and it waits, and the ground gives back what is put into it when the right season comes." Eleanor closed the journal and sat for a long time in the cold kitchen. There was a quality in those words that felt less like historical record and more like direct address, as though the decade between the writing and the reading had collapsed, and Dorothy Vance was simply in the room, sitting at the other end of the old work table, speaking with the patient urgency of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be understood. The right season. Eleanor opened the locket. She had not yet done this. She had carried it in her coat pocket since the morning Morse left her, fingers returning to it periodically the way fingers return to an unresolved thing, and each time she had felt the seam of the clasp and folded it back into her palm without opening it. She wasn't sure why. Some residual sense that it held something she needed to be ready for. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon when she finally pried the clasp open with her thumbnail. Inside was a photograph, small and oval, the sepia warmth of mid-century portraiture, a woman's face in 3/4 profile. Not the same woman from the photographs in the tin box. This woman was younger, perhaps in her 30s, with high cheekbones and a serious mouth, and eyes that held something Eleanor recognized without being able to immediately name. She turned the locket over. On the back, in letters fine enough to have been engraved with a tool narrow as a pin, were 5 words. "For the one who stays." Eleanor read it twice. She set the locket on the table and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something you need perspective on. The woman in the photograph was not Dorothy Vance and was not Edith Vance Coulter. She was someone else entirely, someone Eleanor had no way of identifying, and yet the locket had been placed in the tin box with the letter and the photographs as part of a deliberate arrangement. Not an afterthought, a component. Dorothy had placed this here as part of the message. For the one who stays. Eleanor had stayed. She had not known she was fulfilling a condition when she made the practical decision to sleep on the sofa rather than drive back to town in Nadine's borrowed car. She had stayed because leaving had felt like something she would regret, because there was something in the house that required more of her attention than one afternoon's visit could provide, because the letter under the floorboard had said, "Do not leave yet," and she had found she was not ready to leave. But the locket suggested the staying had been anticipated. The locket suggested that the staying was the point. She was still sitting at the table with the locket in her hand when she heard the car. It came up the dirt track at a deliberate pace, not the careful pace of unfamiliarity with the road, but the deliberate pace of someone who has chosen to approach slowly to give the impression of leisure and control. Eleanor heard it from the kitchen, set the locket down, and walked to the front window. The car in the clearing was not Morse's black sedan. It was a newer vehicle, a large American model, in a dark shade of blue polished to a condition that seemed excessive for a vehicle that was going to encounter this road. The man who got out of it was in his mid-60s, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who were once physically powerful and have moved into the kind of authority that does not require physical power anymore. He was wearing a coat that cost more than Eleanor had earned in a month at the diner. His shoes were polished, which in the context of the packed dirt clearing struck Eleanor as a form of statement. He stood beside the car and looked at the estate with an expression that was carefully neutral, in the practiced way of people who have learned that expressions are a form of currency and you don't spend them carelessly. Then he looked at the window where Eleanor was standing. She went to the door. He was walking toward the porch before she reached it, carrying the easy forward momentum of a man accustomed to being the person who initiates. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, which put him slightly below her on the physical hierarchy of the moment, and offered a smile that had been refined to the point of near authenticity. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, not a question. He knew her name. He had come here knowing her come. "You have me at a disadvantage," Eleanor said. "Warren Hargrove." He said it the way people say names that have been local currency for generations, not as introduction, but as context. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "You are resigned," Eleanor said. "What can I do for you?" He shifted his weight slightly, a gesture that was not discomfort, but a performance of ease. "I heard about the Vance property passing to a new owner. I wanted to come by personally and welcome you." He paused. "And I wanted to have a frank conversation if you're open to it." "About?" He looked at the house with the expression of a man appraising something he has already decided to acquire. "About the state of the property. The difficulty of maintaining something like this, isolated out here, the structural challenges." He looked back at her. "The burden of it." "I haven't found it particularly burdensome," Eleanor said. His smile adjusted slightly, recalibrating. "I have a long history with this property. My family has had an interest in this land for many years." He reached into the interior pocket of the expensive coat and produced an envelope. "I'd like to make it easy for you, Mrs. Marsh. Take this property off your hands and allow you to move into something more appropriate to your current situation." He held out the envelope. Eleanor looked at it. "Open it," he said. She took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a number on it. $75,000. She looked at the number for a long moment. A week ago, a month ago, a year ago. $75,000 would have had a specific gravity to it, the gravity of solutions of heat and food and medical care, and saw a door with a lock that was hers. It would have landed in her chest with the particular weight of survival made suddenly possible. She was aware that the number was large. She was aware that there were practical arguments for it that were real and serious, and that no reasonable person would dismiss. But Warren Hargrove had arrived at this property within days of her taking possession of it, which meant someone had told him, and whoever had told him quickly, which meant he had been watching for exactly this event. He had come with a check already written. He had come knowing her name, knowing her situation, knowing the precise form in which this offer would be most effective. He had come prepared. A man does not prepare this carefully for something that doesn't frighten him. Eleanor folded the paper back into the envelope and held it out toward him. "For a property that everyone in town told me should have been torn down 30 years ago," she said. "That's generous." He did not take the envelope back. "Sentimental value. My family has history on this land." "I know," Eleanor said. Something moved behind his eyes. Quick control gone before it fully formed. "I'm sorry." "I said I know. Your family has history on this land." She set the envelope on the porch railing between them. "I've been reading about it." The air in the clearing shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. Hargrove's face maintained its expression of composed courtesy, but it required visible effort now. The effort of a man maintaining a posture against a current he hadn't expected. "I'm not sure what you think you've been reading," he said. "I think I've been reading the truth," Eleanor said. "I think you're standing here because you already knew this property held something your family has spent a long time hoping would stay buried. And I think $75,000 is what that something is worth to you in terms of not having to find out whether it's still intact." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the warmth had left his voice, not completely but enough. "Mrs. Marsh, I mean what I'm about to say with respect. You've had a difficult period, I understand that. And I understand that an offer like this one looks like a solution. It is a solution, a real one." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "There are things in this town that are older than you understand. Arrangements that have existed for a very long time. It would be unwise to position yourself in opposition to those arrangements without understanding fully what that means." Eleanor looked at him, standing below her on the porch steps in his polished shoes on the packed dirt of the clearing, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not anger, and was not fear, and was not the cautious wariness she had learned to carry through years of being overlooked. It was something quieter than those, something with more patience in it. "What it means," she said, "is exactly what I'm trying to find out." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he picked up the envelope from the porch railing and put it back in his coat with the precise composure of a man who is not finished, but has decided that today's conversation is. "Think carefully," he said. He turned and walked back to the car. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the dark blue vehicle back through the clearing and disappear down the dirt track through the trees. The sound of the engine faded. The woods returned to their silence. The bare maples stood in their patient rows. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the journals. Then she opened the one she hadn't yet finished and kept reading. Morse called that evening on the cell phone Nadine had insisted Eleanor borrow along with the car. He had been at the county record office all afternoon, and his voice had the particular quality of controlled agitation that she had come to associate with moments when what he'd found was worse than he'd expected. "The boundary discrepancies are real," he said. "I've been cross-referencing Dorothy's original survey maps against the filed county records. The alterations are not small. We're talking about significant redrawn parcel lines in at least 4 separate filings between 1944 and 1951. And the filing dates are internally inconsistent. Documents filed as original records bear dates that post-date the surveys they supposedly reflect." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove it?" "I can show it. The proof will require expert testimony about the cartography and the signatures. But as a prima facie record of irregularity, yes, this is documentable." A pause. "There's something else." She waited. "I asked the clerk to pull the demolition permit records for the Vance property. Over the last 11 years, there have been 3 applications for mandatory demolition of the structure on the grounds of structural hazard and public safety risk." 3 applications, Eleanor said. All 3 were filed by a firm called Meridian Property Services. I looked them up. They're a property management subsidiary. The parent company is Hargrove Holdings. The house was quiet around her. The lantern on the table made a warm circle that didn't reach the corners of the kitchen. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the upper branches of the pines in the long, low sound that Vermont makes in the late evenings of October, a sound that is either comfort or loneliness, depending entirely on whether you are inside or out. "They weren't trying to buy it," Eleanor said. "They were trying to erase it. 3 times in 11 years, someone stopped them on procedural grounds. The 3rd application was denied 8 months ago. 2 months later, Edith Vance Coulter finalized her will." Morse's voice was careful. "I don't think the timing is coincidental." Eleanor thought about Edith at 78, living out her last years, knowing that the clock on the property was running, knowing that eventually the procedural grounds would run out, knowing she had to find someone before the house came down. 8 months of searching, the specific urgency of a person who understands what happens if they run out of time. "She found me just in time," Eleanor said. "Barely?" Morse agreed. After she hung up, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the 3 demolition applications. She thought about Ellison Hargrove in the 1940s with his forged signatures and his appropriated acres, and about the generations between him and Warren, and about the polished shoes on the porch steps that afternoon, and the way the warmth had left the man's voice when she'd made clear she wasn't afraid of what she knew. She thought about Agnes Pruitt writing on plain paper in labored handwriting because someone needed to know the true story of what happened. She thought about Dorothy Vance looking out the kitchen window at the backwoods and writing her truth into 6 calfskin journals and sealing them in an iron-banded chest in the cellar and trusting the ground to keep them. She thought about Edith spending the years she had left looking for someone. She was still sitting there when the sound came from the porch, a soft, specific sound, the sound of paper being slid under a door that didn't quite meet its threshold. Eleanor sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and went to the front door and opened it. The porch was empty. The clearing was dark, the tree line invisible against the night sky. She stepped out and looked in both directions along the dirt track and heard nothing, saw nothing, the darkness complete and the silence unbroken by any sound of footsteps or an engine. She looked down. On the threshold, just inside the door's edge, was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up. Walk away. 2 words, no signature. The handwriting was plain and nondescript. The handwriting of someone who understood that nondescript handwriting is its own form of concealment. Eleanor stood on the dark porch with the unsigned note in her hand and looked out at the clearing and the trees and the night over Harlow, Vermont. She felt the cold on her face and the rough wood of the porch rail under her free hand and the particular stillness of a place that has been here longer than anyone currently standing in it. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She went inside and added it to the pile of documents on the kitchen table, between the letter from Agnes Pruitt and the entry in Dorothy's 3rd journal, where the handwriting's pressure had deepened. Then she sat down and opened the journal to the page she'd marked and kept reading. Not because she was unafraid. The fear was real and appropriate, and she did not pretend otherwise to herself. But she had spent years learning the difference between fear that instructs and fear that controls, and she had learned that the version worth respecting was the first kind, and the version worth refusing was the second. The unsigned note on her threshold was the second kind. It was the note of a person who wanted her afraid enough to stop. The fact that they had written it and delivered it in the dark meant they had already concluded that the daylight approach had not been sufficient. Warren Hargrove had not gotten what he needed from the conversation on the porch, so someone had come in the dark. Eleanor kept reading. The journals moved into the late 1960s, Dorothy's voice growing sparser and more essentials, decades of sustained vigilance, visible in the compressed quality of the entries, the way each word now carried the weight of all the words that had come before it. Near the end of the final volume, an entry dated with only a month and season, rather than a specific date. I have done what I could. I have kept what I could keep. Whoever finds this will understand what to do with it, or they won't. And I have to believe the right person will come to this house because the wrong ones have already come and left without finding what they wanted. I am not afraid of what happens to me. I am only afraid of what happens to the truth if nobody carries it forward. Someone will carry it forward. That is the faith I am choosing. Someone will come and they will not be afraid of what they find here, and they will not be bought, and they will not be quiet, and they will stand in whatever room this truth needs to be spoken in, and they will speak it. I am choosing to believe this. Eleanor read the entry again. Then she closed the journal carefully and held it in both hands for a moment, the worn leather warm from her handling the weight of it, exactly the weight of something that has been carried a long time by someone who has gone and left it for the next pair of hands. She set it down on the table with the others. Outside, the Vermont night pressed close and cold and patient around the old house in the hollow. Inside, the lantern held its small circle of warm light against the dark. And on the kitchen table, 6 journals and a packet of forged documents and a note written by a dead woman who had never stopped believing that the right person would eventually come lay waiting to be carried forward. Eleanor put both hands flat on the table. She looked at what Dorothy Vance had spent a lifetime protecting. She thought about Gerald Morse at the county record office piecing together the documentary evidence that would turn Dorothy's handwritten account into something a court could hold. She thought about Hargrove's 3 demolition applications, his $75,000 offer, his unsigned note delivered in the dark. She thought about the specific calculation in all of those actions, the calculation of a person who understood that a document properly buried could be buried forever. but that a person properly frightened would bury it herself. He had not accounted for the possibility that she had nothing left to be frightened with. That was the thing. That was the precise and specific thing. You could only threaten a person effectively if they had something they were afraid to lose. Warren Hargrove had stood on her porch with $75,000, an implicit threat, and the full weight of 3 generations of institutional comfort and local authority behind him. And all of it had been calibrated for a person who still believed he was holding something she needed. He had miscalculated, because Eleanor Marsh had already lost everything, and she was still here, and she was not leaving, and the truth that Dorothy Vance had spent her life protecting was going to leave this kitchen and go into whatever room it needed to be in, and Eleanor was going to be the one who carried it there. She took the lantern and went through the house, checking the window latches and the back door. Then she came back to the kitchen table and sat down with the journals and the maps and the letters and the documents spread before her in the small, warm light, and she stayed with them through the rest of the night, learning every name, every date, every forged signature, every acre of stolen ground, committing it to the kind of memory that does not forget the memory of a person who has been entrusted with something and understands the weight of that trust completely. The house settled around her in the dark. Dorothy Vance had kept the truth for decades. Eleanor Marsh had been keeping it for 3 days, and already it had sent a man in a polished coat to her porch and an unsigned note under her door. Good, she thought. That meant it was real. Stayed. The county courthouse in Harlow stood at the intersection of Main Street and Veterans Boulevard, a red brick building from the 1890s that had been added to twice and renovated once, and had absorbed all of those changes without losing the essential quality of its original construction, which was solidity. Not beauty exactly, not the architectural ambition of courthouses in larger cities, but the specific credibility of a building that had been built to last by people who understood that the law required a physical anchor, something that communicated permanence and weight, and the idea that what happened inside these walls would be taken seriously. Eleanor had walked past it dozens of times over the years, carrying coffee orders and dry cleaning and grocery bags and all the other freight of an ordinary life in a small town. She had never had reason to go inside. She went inside on a Wednesday morning in early November, 3 weeks after Gerald Morse had first sat beside her on the bench in the town square. The hallway outside the hearing room was busier than she had expected. Word had moved through Harlow in the particular way of small-town intelligence, not through any single channel, but through the aggregate of dozens of small transmissions, a mention at the pharmacy's counter, a lowered voice at the gas station, a phone call between neighbors, the specific alertness that a community develops when something is happening that touches the ground everyone is standing on. The people in the hallway were not all there for the hearing. Some of them were simply present in the way that people are present when they sense that something historic is occurring in close proximity and they want to be near it. Eleanor walked through the hallway with Morse beside her, and she felt the attention, without acknowledging it the way she had always felt the attention of the diner at its busiest present, and aware without being distracted from the work at hand. Morse had spent 2 weeks preparing. The county records had produced what he needed: discrepancies between Dorothy's original surveys and the filed county boundaries that were documentable and significant. An independent cartographer in Burlington had reviewed Dorothy's maps against the current county GIS data and produced a written assessment that used careful professional language to describe what was in plain terms systematic alteration. 2 of the forged transfer signatures had been evaluated by a document examiner who had 30 years of forensic experience and whose report used the word inconsistent in the specific way that forensic experts use it when they mean fraudulent but are being precise about what they can demonstrate. The evidence was substantial, but it was Eleanor who was going to present it. This had been her decision, arrived at not dramatically, but through the quiet logic of understanding what the hearing actually was. It was not a trial yet. It was an evidentiary hearing to determine whether the Collins material was credible enough to reopen claims against current property holdings. The standard was not beyond reasonable doubt, but sufficient credibility to warrant further inquiry. And Eleanor had concluded, after 3 weeks of sleeping in the house where Dorothy Vance had kept her truth, and reading every word Dorothy had written across 6 journals and 40 years of patient documentation, that the person best suited to carry those words into a room was the person who had spent 3 weeks living inside them. Morse had not argued with her. He had looked at her across the kitchen table the evening before the hearing and said only, "You know the material well enough to answer any challenge." "I know it better than that," Eleanor said. He had nodded. "Yes, I think you do." Warren Hargrove arrived at the courthouse at 9:40 with three attorneys in dark suits who moved around him in the organized way of people whose function is to occupy space and project competence. He was wearing a navy overcoat in the expression of a man who had decided that the correct posture for this morning was one of patient tolerance for a minor inconvenience. Eleanor watched him come through the hallway doors from where she stood near the window, and she watched him identify her across the room with the quick, assessing glance of someone scanning for the specific source of a problem. He crossed the hallway toward her before his attorneys could arrange themselves to prevent it or facilitate it. "Mrs. Marsh." His voice was the voice from the porch, the warm professional register that was a performance of ease. "There is still time to resolve this without the hearing." Eleanor looked at him. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove. I'm asking you to consider carefully what you're doing here." He spoke quietly, pitched below the ambient noise of the hallway, the voice of a man who understood that the content of what he was saying was not for general circulation. "You are positioning yourself in opposition to people who have been part of this community for generations. Whatever you think those documents say, the interpretation of old records is a complicated business. This could go in a number of directions." "It could," Eleanor said. "The offer stands." He held her gaze. "More if you'd like to discuss the number." Eleanor thought about Agnes Pruitt writing on plain paper, in the handwriting of a woman who had never been taught to read or write, but understood that someone needed to know the true story. She thought about Dorothy Vance looking out the kitchen window for 4 decades, keeping what could not be kept any other way. She thought about the unsigned note slid under her door in the dark. "The hearing starts in 20 minutes, she said. Something hardened behind his eyes fully this time, without the practiced recovery that had contained it before. "You are making a mistake." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I've made mistakes before. I can tell the difference." He held her gaze for one more moment, then turned and walked back toward his attorneys. Morse appeared at her shoulder. "All right." "Yes," she said. "Let's go in." The hearing room was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, which made it feel paradoxically more serious. Large rooms distribute gravity. Small rooms concentrate it. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Owens, who had the contained, precise manner of someone who had spent years developing the skill of listening to partial truths and identifying what was missing. She had read the preliminary filings. She asked questions before the formal presentation, began practical questions about provenance and chain of custody and the methodology of the document examination, and she asked them with the directness of someone who was not performing authority, but exercising it. Eleanor sat at the petitioner's table with the journals and the maps and the document examiner's report and the cartographer's assessment arranged before her in the order she had organized them the previous evening at the kitchen table, each item in its sequence, the sequence building toward the thing it was meant to demonstrate. She began with Dorothy Vance, not with the documents, with the woman. She understood from 31 years of serving people in a room and learning how attention works that the facts would land differently if the person who produced them first existed as a human being in the listener's understanding. Dorothy Vance had been born in 1908 and had lived on the Harlow property her entire life and had kept a record of what happened to her neighbors and to the land around her property because she understood that the record would be the only form of accountability available to people whose testimony the world around them had already decided to dismiss. Eleanor read from the first journal, not extensively, not at the length she had read it herself across those evenings in the cold kitchen. Selectively. The passages that established Dorothy's credibility as an observer. The passages that established her method. The entry where she had first noted the names and dates and acreages that would become the foundation of everything else. Then she presented the maps. The cartographer's report did most of the technical work, but Eleanor walked through the comparison between Dorothy's original surveys and the current county filings, with a clarity that came from having lived with those maps long enough to understand them, not as abstractions, but as the actual shapes of the actual ground. 4 parcel lines moved. Boundaries redrawn after the surveys that were supposed to precede them. Filed documentation postdating the dates it recorded. Hargrove's lead attorney objected twice. Judge Owen sustained one objection and overruled the other with the same even composure and moved the proceeding forward without drama. Then Eleanor presented the transfer documents. She placed the two forged transfers side by side on the evidence display board, the way Morse had placed them on the kitchen table 3 weeks ago, and she described what the document examiner's report concluded in plain language that required no translation. Same hand, two names, one forger. A pattern repeated across at least 4 transactions between 1944 and 1951. She read the sworn statement of Agnes Pruitt. She read the full text slowly, the labored handwriting translated into Eleanor's steady voice in the hearing room. And when she reached the sentence at the center of it, the sentence that had made her set the letter down and step back from it the first time she read it at the same pace as the sentences around it, without emphasis, because it did not need emphasis. It carried its own weight. They told me I signed. I told them I cannot write my own name. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has landed that changes the acoustic quality of the space. Hargrove's table did not move. The attorneys conferred in the quiet way of people managing a situation rather than responding to it. It was in the interval following Agnes Pruitt's statement, while Eleanor was organizing the final set of documents for presentation, that the sound came from the back of the room. A chair pushing back, footsteps on the wooden floor. Judge Owens looked up. Eleanor turned. The man who had stood from his seat in the third row of the observer's gallery was in his early 70s, tall and spare, with the upright bearing of a man who had carried himself carefully for a long time. His hair was entirely white, close cut, and his face held the specific composure of someone who has made a decision that has cost him something and has decided to make it anyway. He was holding a Bible in both hands, a large, old King James edition with a worn black cover and gilt page edges that had dulled to a pale gold. He held it the way you hold something that is also a record. Judge Owens said, "Sir, this is an evidentiary hearing, not an open forum." The man said, "My name is James Whitfield. My grandfather's name was Ernest Whitfield. He owned 14 acres on the North Fork of Billet Creek in this county from 1931 until 1947, when a transfer document was filed with the county recorder's office that bore his signature." He paused. "My grandfather died in April of 1947. The transfer document was filed in September of 1947. The room was completely still. "My family has known about this for 60 years, Whitfield said. "We didn't say anything because we understood what saying something was and what it was likely to produce." He looked at Eleanor, and the look was not gratitude exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been watching a door for a very long time and has just seen someone open it. "I'm saying something now." He held out the Bible to the bailiff. "There are documents inside this. Original documents. My grandmother kept them. She told my mother told me. I have been carrying them for 30 years, waiting to understand what to do with them. The documents were originals. A deed of title in Ernest Whitfield's name dated 1931, a tax receipt for 1946, a letter from the county assessor's office addressed to Ernest Whitfield postmarked June 1947, 3 months after his death, requesting his attendance at a transfer proceeding, and a sworn affidavit from Whitfield's widow, Clara Whitfield, handwritten and notarized in October 1947, stating that her husband had died in April of that year, and that she had not signed any transfer documents and had not authorized any representative to do so on her behalf, and that she was recording this statement because she had been told that no further recourse was available to her, and she wanted the truth to exist somewhere even if it could not be acted upon. Hargrove's lead attorney was on his feet. The objection was procedurally sound, and Judge Owens acknowledged it. She called a brief recess to assess the admissibility of the new material. Eleanor sat at the petitioner's table and looked at the documents she had brought from Dorothy's chest and felt the specific weight of the moment. Not triumph, it was too early and too serious for triumph, but something structural. The feeling of a thing that has been built on insufficient foundation for a very long time finally encountering the ground it should have rested on all along. Morse leaned close to her. "She's going to allow it. The provenance is clean, and it corroborates existing material." "I know," Eleanor said. She looked back at James Whitfield, who had returned to his seat in the gallery and was sitting with the empty Bible in his hands, the documents now with the bailiff. He was looking at the front of the room with an expression that Eleanor recognized because she had felt it herself in the kitchen of the old house on the night she had read Dorothy's last journal entry. The expression of a person who has been carrying something for so long that the setting down of it produces a feeling that is not quite relief, but is the precursor to it, the moment when the weight lifts and the body begins cautiously to believe that it might be permitted to straighten. She caught his eye. He gave her a single slow nod, the nod of a person acknowledging a shared understanding across a distance that has been too long. She nodded back. Judge Owens returned from recess and admitted the Whitfield documents into the evidentiary record. The hearing concluded 2 hours later. The judge did not rule from the bench. She gathered the full record and informed both parties that she would issue her decision in writing within 10 days. Hargrove's attorneys spoke quietly together as the room cleared. Hargrove himself did not speak. He left with his team in the tight, coordinated way they had arrived, and he did not look at Eleanor as he passed, which told her more than the look would have. Outside, the November sky over Harlow was low and colorless, the kind of sky that is not threatening anything, but has simply stopped trying. The maple trees along Main Street stood bare and exact against it, their branches the color of old iron. Morse stopped beside her on the courthouse steps. "You did that well." Eleanor watched the traffic light at the corner blink through its cycle. "Dorothy did it. I just read what she wrote." "That's not the same thing," Morse said, "and you know it." Before she could answer, a woman approached from the sidewalk. She was in her mid-70s, neatly dressed in a gray wool coat with gloved hands folded around a handbag that she was holding more tightly than the weight of it required. Her face had the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say many times and is still not certain they will be able to say it. "Mrs. Marsh," the woman said. Eleanor looked at her. "My name is Patricia Gruel. My father used to say that his mother cried the day they lost their land, but nobody in town believed her. He said she would show him the place where the fence line used to be out on the old Billet Creek Road, and she would explain what had happened, and he never knew whether to believe her or whether she was confused." The woman's voice was steady, but its steadiness required effort. "He's been gone for 12 years. But I want him to know somehow. I want it to be on the record that she wasn't confused." Eleanor put her hand on the woman's arm. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed to be said that the moment was not already saying. The cold air, and the bare trees in the courthouse behind them, and the long distance between 1947 and this particular Wednesday morning on a sidewalk in Harlow, Vermont. Some griefs only require witness. The judge's written decision arrived on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the hearing, in a manila envelope addressed to Gerald Morse at his firm's address. He brought it to the estate that afternoon and set it on the kitchen table and sat across from Eleanor while she read it. The court found the Dorothy Vance records credible. Credible in the legal sense, meaning sufficient in consistency and corroboration to constitute a viable basis for further formal inquiry. The decision did not adjudicate the underlying land claims. It could not. The tangle of parcels and heirs and decades of subsequent transactions was too complex for a single evidentiary hearing to resolve. What the decision did was establish that the fraud had been real and was now a matter of record, and that the current holders of property with a potentially fraudulent chain of title were on notice that those claims existed and were being pursued. For Harlow, that was sufficient. By the following Monday, the story had left the courthouse and entered the town in the way that things enter small towns when the subject touches ground that people are standing on. The local paper ran it above the fold. A regional outlet picked it up and ran a longer piece that named the Hargrove family specifically and quoted from the document examiner's report. 2 county commissioners issued a statement expressing concern and calling for a full review of historical property records. Eleanor heard from James Whitfield on the Tuesday after the decision. He called the number Morse had given him, and they spoke for a long time, not about the legal proceedings exactly, but about the longer arc of things, about what it meant to carry something for 60 years and then be able to put it down. His grandmother Clara had died in 1971. His mother had died in 2003. He had grown up understanding that there were things in the family's history that could not be addressed in his lifetime. And then one morning he had read a brief notice in the paper about an evidentiary hearing regarding old property records in Harlow County, and something had shifted in him. "I almost didn't come," he said. "I drove to the courthouse, and I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Eleanor thought about sitting in Nadine's borrowed car in the clearing, looking at the estate through the windshield, waiting for something inside herself to settle. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "You were already in there doing it." The offers came in the 2 weeks following the decision, not from Hargrove directly, but from intermediaries, a property management firm, a real estate attorney in Burlington, a developer who specialized in what his brochure called rural estate conversion. The numbers were different from Hargrove's original 75,000. They were larger, substantially larger. Morse laid the highest offer on the kitchen table one evening in late November with the careful neutrality of a man who is presenting information rather than advocating for a position. Eleanor looked at the number. It was enough. That was the honest accounting of it, and she gave it the honest accounting it deserved. It was enough to buy a small house outright or a long-term lease on a good apartment in Burlington or Montpelier. Enough for the medical care she had been delaying. Enough for winter that didn't require management for food, that didn't require rationing for the 100 small dignities that money provides by removing the constant low-level problem-solving that poverty requires. She was 62 years old, and she had been sleeping on a park bench 4 months ago, and the number on that paper represented the end of the kind of fear that had become so habitual she had nearly stopped noticing it as fear. She understood all of that. She sat with it. Morse waited, which she appreciated. He was good at waiting. He had the patience of a man who understood that some decisions reveal themselves in their own time and that the worst thing you can do to a decision in progress is crowd it. Sandra Holt came by the following afternoon with a pan of cornbread and stayed for coffee and said with the directness of a woman who had decided she liked Eleanor enough to be honest, "Ellie, that number in the paper is your life taken care of. Nobody would blame you for taking it. Nobody who knows what you've been through." Eleanor poured the coffee. "I know," she said. Sandra looked at her over the rim of her cup with the attentiveness of someone who has known enough people to recognize when a person has already made a decision and is simply not yet ready to say it out loud. That evening, Eleanor walked through the house alone. She had not yet done this with this specific intention, moved from room to room, with the purpose of seeing what the house had become since she had arrived in it on that cold October morning with a ring of old keys and nothing else. The front room was clean, and the furniture stood in its proper shapes without their coverings, the wingback chair and the walnut sideboard, and the faded braided rug visible now, and particular objects chosen by specific hands for specific reasons. The windows were repaired well enough to keep the worst of the cold out. The fireplace worked. She had burned 3 fires in it in the past 2 weeks, and the chimney had proved sound. The sitting room held its quiet. The loose floorboard had been relaid with the tin box now kept on the mantel, rather than underneath it, an argument about what deserved to be visible. The photographs from the box were on the wall, straight, their faded faces present, rather than overlooked. She stood in the kitchen and put both hands on the old work table. The 6 journals were on the shelf above the counter, where she had put them after the hearing, no longer in the chest, no longer underground. The maps were framed, 2 of them, the originals preserved in archival sleeves that Morse had obtained from a preservation specialist in Burlington. Dorothy's surveys hung beside the kitchen window, the same window through which Dorothy had looked for 40 years, the same window through which the back clearing was visible in the pale light, the tree line dark and close, impatient in the November evening. Eleanor stood in the room where Dorothy Vance had kept the truth for decades. She thought about what this place had been before she arrived. A sealed space. A thing held in suspension, its purpose unrealized, its contents pressing upward against the floor of an empty kitchen, waiting for the season that Dorothy had written about in her final journal entry, with the faith of a woman who had run out of alternatives to faith. She thought about what the developer's offer would make it. A conversion, the brochure had said. A rural estate conversion. She had read that phrase several times, and each time it produced in her the specific mild nausea of language that is designed to make erasure sound like improvement. She thought about the bench in the town square, about the particular quality of the town's practiced invisibility toward her, the developed skill of not seeing the social efficiency of treating suffering as scenery. She thought about the cot at St. Luke's and Nadine's careful gentleness and the expiration dates on every mercy offered. She thought about the word temporary and how it had accumulated over years into a weight she had stopped fully feeling because feeling it fully was not compatible with continuing. She thought about the night she had first slept in this house on the faded sofa in the front room, with the coat that wasn't warm enough and the cold that was. Inside, she had thought, I am inside. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then she went and found Morse's number and called him. I'm not selling, she said. A pause. Not surprised, she didn't think. Recognition. All right, he said. I need you to help me understand what's possible with it instead. What was possible turned out to be more than she had initially framed in her thinking, partly because Morse understood the legal architecture of property use more practically than she did, and partly because once she had named what she wanted to do with the house, the shape of it clarified with the quick logic of ideas that were already formed and waiting to be recognized. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest version of what a house could be, what a house was fundamentally for. A place where people could be inside. A place that did not disappear in the morning. She called it Vance House. Morse had suggested the name, and Eleanor had accepted it immediately, not because it was Morse's idea, but because it was right. Dorothy Vance had spent her life ensuring that the truth would survive her. Eleanor was simply giving the truth somewhere warm to live. The legal structure took 3 weeks to establish a private residential trust with Eleanor as trustee, the property held in the trust with specific provisions governing its use. Morse waived most of his fees, citing reasons he described as personal and declined to elaborate on. A local contractor named Bill Sorensen, whose grandfather's name Eleanor recognized from one of Dorothy's journals as one of the millworking families who had lost land, came to look at the structure and spent an afternoon going from room to room, making notes, and then sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table and said that the bones of the house were sound, that the work needed was real but finite, and that he would do it at cost. Why? Eleanor asked. He looked at the journals on the shelf above the counter. Same reason as you, I expect, he said. The work took 6 weeks. The roof was reshingled in the sections that had begun to fail. The porch was rebuilt entirely new timber, matching the dimension of the original, then third step replaced, and the railing reset solid. The worst interior walls were repaired and painted with a white that the contractor mixed himself to match the original, a particular shade that was not stark but warm, closer to cream. The kitchen was fitted with a working range and a refrigerator that Sandra Holt had found at an estate sale in Montpelier and delivered in her station wagon. The upstairs rooms, 3 of them were cleaned and painted and fitted with simple furniture, beds and chairs and small dressers, the kind of furniture that is good because it is solid and adequately sized, not because it is decorative. Fresh blankets arrived in boxes, lamps, a box of second-hand books sorted by someone who had paid attention to the selection, a basket of wool scarves, various sizes, clearly knitted by various hands at various times. A set of framed photographs from the Historical Society in town, images of the county in the 1920s and 1930s, the working landscape before the dispossessions, families standing outside their farms with the solemn confidence of people who know where they belong. Eleanor accepted all of it with the same rule each time. This is not charity. This is dignity. There is a difference. Henry Goss arrived on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December, 2 weeks before Christmas, when the first real cold of winter had settled over Harlow and the ground was hard and the sky held the flat white promise of snow. He was 73 years old and narrow and dressed in layers that were functional rather than warm, a hospital identification band still around his left wrist. That he appeared to have forgotten was there a cardboard suitcase secured with nylon twine sitting beside him on the porch. He had been at Harlow Regional for 5 days following a fall and a mild cardiac event, and the discharge nurse had made calls that eventually reached Nadine Foss, who had called Eleanor. Henry stood on the repaired porch and looked at the front door and then at Eleanor, and the quality of his expression was the expression of a man who has been offered kindness enough times with conditions attached that he had developed a comprehensive skepticism toward the unconditioned version. You running this place? He asked. I live here, Eleanor said. She opened the door wider. Come in. That's not what I asked. I know, but it's the more important answer. He looked at the warm room behind her, the lamp on the table, the fire in the hearth, the ordinary furniture sitting in its ordinary arrangement, in the way of a room where someone actually lived. Something moved through his expression that was too quick to fully catalog. What's the catch? He said. Eleanor had spent 31 years reading the subtext beneath what people said, when they sat down in front of her. She heard what Henry Goss was actually asking, which was not about practical terms or conditions or the fine print of some arrangement. He was asking whether this was the kind of thing that would be there in the morning. "You come in," she said. "You eat. You sleep warm. You don't apologize for taking up space." Henry looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly in the way of a man deciding something. "Nobody said that to me in years," he said. His voice was roughened by cold and by the specific wear of a life lived too long without adequate shelter, and the sentence came out with more in it than the words themselves carried, the way sentences sometimes do when a person has been holding the need to say something for long enough that saying it produces more than the saying. Eleanor stepped back from the door. He came inside. Marion Cole arrived 10 days after Henry, referred by the county social services office, a woman in her late 60s who had been moving between her adult children's homes in the uncomfortable way of a person who is too much trouble to turn away and not quite welcome enough to settle. She had a canvas bag and a portable radio, in the habit of singing softly to herself when she washed dishes, which she did without being asked on her second morning at Van's house. Standing at the kitchen sink in the early light with the radio on low and her voice barely above the sound of the water. Earl Dawson came 2 weeks after Marion. He was 69, a veteran, had been living in his truck for 4 months, following the end of a lease he hadn't been able to renew. He had a bad hip and the careful, deliberate silence of a man who had learned to keep pain folded small and stored where it wouldn't inconvenience anyone. He began stacking wood on his third day without explanation or announcement. Just went to the core to split timber Sorensen had left by the back of the house and started arranging it into a proper stack against the wall where it would stay driest, the work of his hands, speaking the language that his words apparently no longer fully trusted. Vera Hutchins came in early January with 2 hat boxes and a carpet bag and a jaw set at an angle that communicated comprehensive opinions about most things. She was 74. She had been, she informed Eleanor, on first meeting a high school English teacher for 37 years, and she wanted it understood that her presence in the current situation was the result of a sequence of events she had not invited and did not endorse, but that since she was here, she intended to manage it with appropriate standards. On her first evening at the dinner table, she corrected Henry's grammar twice and Earl's once, and Henry told her that nobody asked her, and she told him that unasked correction was the most important kind. And Marion laughed from the kitchen, and Earl asked if there was more bread. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to the 4 of them and felt something in her chest that she had not expected and did not immediately have words for something that arrived in the way that things arrive when you have been absent from them for long enough that the return feels like a new discovery rather than a restoration. It was the sound of ordinary life conducted by people who had been deprived of ordinary life long enough to recognize its value in a way that people for whom it has always been available generally do not. The particular attentiveness of people who know what it costs. The specific quality of people eating a meal together who understand that the meal's not merely fuel but evidence. Evidence that they exist in a space that has decided to accommodate them, that has organized itself around the fact of their presence and is not going to revise that decision in the morning. Nadine Foss came by on a Tuesday afternoon in January and stood in the kitchen with her coat still on and her eyes moving around the room at the repairs and the lamps and the journals on the shelf and the maps on the wall and the sound of people in the other rooms. And her eyes went bright in the way of a person who had spent years working at the thin edge of what help could offer and was seeing something that exceeded that edge. "I used to worry about where you'd sleep," she said. Eleanor handed her a mug of tea. "Now I worry about whether Henry's been hiding pie." Nadine laughed, and the laugh caught slightly at the end with the specific sound of feeling that has been compressed by professional necessity for too long. She looked around the kitchen once more with a long, absorbing look. "You built something beautiful," she said. Eleanor shook her head. "It was already here. I just stopped it from being lost." Morse came most Friday evenings after the courthouse closed, carrying groceries or papers, or occasionally a bottle of wood oil he claimed someone had overordered. He sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and worked through whatever needed to be worked through that week. The ongoing formal proceedings related to the land fraud inquiry, the trust paperwork, the questions from the County Historical Preservation Office about Dorothy's journals. He was good company in the specific way of people who understand that good company sometimes means simply being present without requiring the conversation to perform itself. One Friday in February, he stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Vera inform Earl that his use of the word irregardless was both non-standard and unnecessary, and Earl responding that he had used it for 69 years without incident, and Marion suggesting that 69 years of something was probably evidence enough that it worked, and Henry eating his soup with the focused attention of a man who had decided to let this particular conflict resolve itself without his participation. Morse said without looking away from the room, "The town thought you inherited a ruin." Eleanor looked at the lamplight on the walls and the steam rising from the pot on the stove and the four people at the table conducting their ordinary evening with the specific ease of people who have been given back something they had stopped expecting to be given. "I inherited a reason," she said. In early March, when the days had lengthened enough to make the difference felt, and the snow on the roof of Vance's house had begun to melt at the southern edge, and the back clearing showed the first gray-green suggestion of ground emerging beneath the white, a reporter from Montpelier drove up the dirt track in a small blue hatchback and sat on the repaired porch with Eleanor for an hour. She was young and attentive, and she asked her questions with the careful respect of someone who understood she was in the presence of something she needed to get right. The question she asked last was the one reporters always ask, the question shaped to extract a lesson clean enough for a headline. "After everything you lost," she said, "why not keep this for yourself? Why open it up?" Eleanor sat in the old rocking chair that now lived permanently on the porch, her hands in her coat pockets, looking out at the clearing and the tree line and the gray sky above the bare maple tops. "Someone a long time ago believed that the right person would find this place," she said. "Not the richest person, not the most important one, the right one." She was quiet for a moment, watching the shadow of a cloud move across the clearing. "I think the right person was never meant to keep the door closed." The article ran the following week. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with her coffee and thought it was reasonably accurate, and that some of the things that mattered most could not be adequately captured by any description of events, which was true of all the things that mattered most. The reporter had asked for a quote to end with, and Eleanor had given her the one about the right person and the door, and the reporter had used it, and it was fine. But it was not the thing Eleanor carried most closely from those months. The thing she carried most closely had not been said to any reporter. It had been said in the kitchen on an evening in late January by Henry Goss. He had come in from the cold, carrying an armful of wood that Earl had split and stacked, and he had set it by the fireplace and straightened up with the careful slowness of a man managing a body that required more management than it used to. He looked at the fire already burning in the hearth, and then at the room, at Marion's cardigan hanging on the hook by the door, and Earl's boots drying on the mat, and the sound of Vera and Marion talking in the kitchen, and the smell of the soup that had been on the stove since mid-afternoon. He said it without looking at Eleanor, said it with the offhand quality of a man stating something he had been thinking for a while and had decided deserved to be said out loud. "I forgot what this was like," he said, "being somewhere that doesn't have an ending date." Eleanor looked at the fire. "Me too," she said. The first heavy snow of the year came in late March, late enough to be a surprise, the kind of snowfall that arrives after the first stirrings of warmth have made people incautious about the remaining winter. It came overnight quietly, the way genuine things often arrive without announcement, simply present when morning came. Eleanor woke to the changed quality of the light, the specific brightness of a world that has been covered in white, and she lay for a moment in the warm room, listening to the house to its sounds before she got up. She made coffee and brought a cup to the porch. The clearing was white, and still the tree line soft and blurred at its edges. The sky, the pale, undifferentiated white of snow still coming. The porch railing wore an inch of new snow along its length. The path to the back of the property had disappeared under it. The old timber of the house stood solid and dark against all that white, absorbing the morning without any apparent concern for its own continuity. Eleanor stood at the railing with her coffee, and she was cold properly. Cold, the kind of cold that arrives with snow and means it. She was warm enough, the coat was adequate, but the cold was real. And she felt it, and that was fine. She had learned to make the distinction between cold that threatens and cold that is simply the condition of a particular morning in a particular place, and this was the latter, the cold of a Vermont March that has remembered itself. Behind her inside the house, the sounds began the way they began every morning now. Henry's footsteps heavier on the right side where the hip gave him trouble. The particular clatter of Marion filling the coffee pot. Earl opening the back door to check the temperature, a habit he had brought from somewhere and had not abandoned. Vera's voice already in conversation with someone or something, the particular music of a woman who had spent 4 decades in classrooms and did not easily enter silence. Eleanor stood on the porch and listened to the ordinary morning of people inside a house that was theirs. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Marcus often, not always with the stone and deep water weight of the early years, but with the more complex feeling of a person who has survived the unsurvivable and is still somehow here, standing on a repaired porch in the snow, holding a cup of coffee. She thought about what he would have said about this house, about Dorothy's journals, about Warren Hargrove, and his polished shoes on the dirt clearing, about the hearing, and Agnes Pruitt's letter, and James Whitfield and the Bible he had carried for 30 years. Marcus would have had things to say about all of it. He had been the kind of young man who had things to say about everything, and the things he said were usually worth hearing. She thought about what he would have said about Henry Goss and his cardboard suitcase and his hospital bracelet, and the question he had asked on the porch. What's the catch? She thought he would have laughed, and then he would have sat down across the table from Henry and asked him some question that started sideways and ended up somewhere real, the way Marcus had always asked questions, never quite where you expected them to go. She missed him in the way that becomes simply a condition of life, not an event, but a weather, something present, always in the background, of the days, the altered frequency she had recognized in the house on Birchfield Road after he died, and that she carried with her now, as a part of herself, no longer a wound exactly, or not only a wound, but also the shape of love that has lost its object and found no alternative but to remain. She thought he would have liked this place. She thought he would have liked what it had become. Inside the house, Henry said something, and Earl responded, and then there was a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the opposite. And then Marion laughed, and then Vera said something about the grammatical construction of whatever Henry had just said, and Henry said something back, and the morning continued in its ordinary way, the way mornings continue in places where people have been given back the dignity of ordinary continuance. Eleanor set her coffee cup on the railing. She put both hands on the snow-covered wood and looked out at the white clearing and the trees and the sky beyond them. She thought about a bench in a town square and a cold cup and the town moving around her with the practiced efficiency of indifference. She thought about Edith Vance Coulter, at 78, running out of time and running out of alternatives and finding at the last possible interval a woman on a park bench in Harlow, Vermont, who had lost everything and was still here. She thought about the 8 months of searching and the ring of old keys and the specific weight of a floorboard lifting in a cold room to reveal something that had been waiting underground for decades. She thought about Dorothy's last journal entry, the faith she had chosen. Someone will come. Eleanor looked at the old house behind her, at the dark timber and the repaired porch and the windows where the warm light of the kitchen was already visible against the morning white, and she felt the thing she had been slowly learning to feel over these months. The thing that had arrived gradually without announcement, the way the most permanent things tend to arrive. Not rescue, not reversal, not the undoing of everything that had been done. Belonging. The simplest word for the thing she had not been able to name on the night she first slept inside these walls. The thing the bench had never provided, and the cot at St. Luke's had never provided, and the vouchers, and the referrals, and the temporary mercies had never provided. Not because those things were offered without kindness, but because kindness and belonging are not the same thing, and a person can receive kindness indefinitely and still be outside the circle that belonging describes. She was inside the circle now. She was inside. And because she was inside, Henry Goss was inside. And Marion Cole and Earl Dawson and Vera Hutchins and the people who would come after them, the people Nadine would call about and Sandra would mention, and James Whitfield would quietly send word of through the channels that existed between people who understood what it cost to have nowhere. Dorothy Vance had kept the truth for a lifetime so that the ground would give it back when the right season came. Eleanor Marsh had found it and carried it into the light and then done the one thing that Dorothy's faith had required and that the wrong kind of person could never have managed. She had stayed, and she had opened the door, and she had let other people come through it. The snow fell on the clearing and on the roof of Vance's house and on the repaired porch railing under Eleanor's hands, and the light in the kitchen windows held steady against the white morning, and from inside came the sound of people beginning another ordinary day in a place that would be there when they woke up tomorrow, and the day after that, and on through all the ordinary days ahead, the sound of people who had been given back the one thing that no amount of kindness at arm's length had ever been able to provide. A door that opened and remained open, a place that did not disappear, a morning that was theirs,